We're going to go ahead and get started. Just a reminder that this training will be recorded. This is the fourth training in our second year providing trainings to OCFS. So we're super excited to have you all here today to discuss trauma-informed care in action. Trauma has an impact on not only the individuals we serve, but also everyone we encounter. Trauma can lead to or increase mental illness, substance misuse, and physical illness. The very services that were designed to help individuals sometimes may be the cause of trauma or re-traumatization. Today, we will walk away with an understanding of how to create structures and systems that recognize the trauma that exists and that prioritize the wellness of young people and program staff. So my name is Angela Huff. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the director of DCTs or direct cash transfers here at Point Source Youth, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. Our first hour will be a panel discussion with our distinguished speakers, and our last 30 minutes will be Q&A from the audience. So feel free to use that Q&A section. At any point in time you have questions, please add them there and we will be sure to pull them. And I'm going to actually ask our speakers if they wouldn't mind coming off mute to introduce themselves, and we'll popcorn it. I'll ask Erdacia if you would not mind starting us off.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Erdacia Floyd. I'm calling in from New York City. It's very cold here today. I am currently a teacher, middle school teacher. I just started, this is my first year. So weird now not being a young person or the young person in the room. I've been with Point Source Youth, been on their youth advisory council for 2 to 3 years now. So I've spoken at several panels, at several conferences, and my background was in organizing, originally from Florida. So I did a lot of organizing work down there, really centered in liberating Black people. And in the current role we live in, Black people have a disproportionate amount of trauma. So that is how I'm coming to this work. How I understand trauma is through that sort of organizing lane. And something that really sticks with me, and just thinking about what trauma is this quote by Prentice Hemphill. They say, trauma is inherent to life. Oppression is the organization and distribution of that trauma. So I just wanted to start with that and have us thinking about that definition.
Thank you, Erdacia. And Jamie, if you won't mind introducing yourself.
Hi, my name is Jamie Hunn. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm coming from Atlanta, Georgia, and my background is working in community mental health, psychiatric hospitals, group homes, and teaching and practicing trauma-informed practices, mostly ARC, the Attachment Regulation Competency Framework. And I currently work in employee wellness at a pediatric hospital.
Thank you. Lizzie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lizzie McAdam. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Counseling and Case Management at the Hedrick Martin Institute. We focus on serving LGBTQIA+ youth, particularly youth of color, ages 13 to 24, so teens and young adults, and we're based in New York City as well.
Thanks, Lizzie. And Sebastian.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sebastian. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the program director at Safe Horizon Street Work Project, where we work primarily with runaway and homeless youth between the ages of 16 to 25. We operate drop-in centers as well as a crisis shelter and have an outreach component that goes out into the 5 boroughs.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'm ready to dive into our questions. But before we do that, the audience is asking, who was that quote by again, Erdacia?
Prentice Hemphill.
There you go. All right. So first question, we're talking about trauma-informed care. I think it's a term or terminology that is used quite frequently. But what does it mean? How would you define trauma and trauma-informed care? And Jamie, if you can start us off.
I keep it simple and say it's a distressing experience and hold off on any explanation of like how it impacts you, because everybody is impacted differently. And that bleeds into diagnosing territory.
Awesome. I like that. And I like the simplicity of it. But I'm going to just round robin that one. So Lizzie, how would you define trauma and trauma-informed care?
Well, I think about trauma as similar to what Jamie was pointing out, as something that is based on an individual's experience. So it's important that that the individuals, folks that we're working with, or ourselves, if we've experienced something traumatic, that we get to define something as whether or not it was traumatic to us. And I think the other piece that I'll highlight here around trauma-informed care is that sometimes there is an overemphasis on individual experience and not as much emphasis on systems of harm and systems of oppression and how that impacts people, particularly people who experience disproportionate amounts of harm, people of color, queer folks, trans and gender nonconforming folks, disabled folks. So I think it's particularly important to grapple with not just trauma on an individual level, but how we're looking at systemic harm and fighting against those systems.
Very good point. And I'm hoping to dive into that a little bit more as we go on through our conversation. And I'll pause for a minute. Everyone may see Salima. My coworker is also on the call, and she's just helping me out behind the scenes. So thank you, Salima. But Ardesha, how would you define it?
Yeah, I really love what Lizzie was just saying there about not kind of zooming out and looking at systems, which is why I wanted to start with the quote by Prince Hill, because yeah, I think that we all go through things that we can call trauma in our lives. And when we look at the systems of oppression that we currently have in the world, it's important to understand, to see those systems as kind of distributing trauma or distributing harm disproportionately on our marginalized groups. And when you kind of see it in that way, I think you're able to understand it more holistically, understand why, yeah, we're not just trying to make someone feel better, but we're really trying to change the world and make it so like no one actually has to feel that way anymore. So yeah, for me, trauma-informed care, I want to live my life caring for everyone. As an educator, I want to care for young people. And where I was going with that is I feel like trauma-informed care can sometimes be a little redundant, because automatically when I care, that should be trauma-informed, I guess. But the fact that we've had to, I guess, come up with this phrase trauma-informed care and make it a whole thing, I think it goes back to the system of oppression that we live in, the current state of our world, the fact that we even have to have something called trauma-informed care. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's just what I'm thinking.
No, it definitely does. Sebastian, I'll give you an opportunity to speak as well.
I just want to echo what everyone has already said around trauma. So I don't want to kind of like go into the definition of trauma, but I think trauma-informed care, for me, how I would define it is looking past or looking beyond just the behaviors that are just present in front of us, and understanding that there is a reason why a young person or a person may be reacting in a certain way or behaving in a certain way. I don't want to take up too much time, but there's a story that anytime I'm like orienting new staff to our space, I always like to tell them in terms of how to engage with young folks. But when I first started my career at street work, I was a direct service staff. So I was like in the milieu, kind of walking around, engaging with young folks. And there was one particular young person who just had the music cranked up really loud in the computer area. And I was kind of like walking by back and forth. And I kind of went over to him a couple of times. I was like, hey, can you just turn that thing down just a little bit? He ignored me. So I walked away, and then I came back and I was like, hey, you know, I asked you to turn it down. Can you turn it down just a hair? He ignored me. So I came back again and I was like, all right, listen, I asked you a few times, like, you know, I'm just gonna ask that you leave that space, or turn it down or leave the space. And he had this huge reaction. He's like cursing at me, like, get the F out of my face. Like, who do you think you are? You don't know me. Back up. And for me, it felt like such an outsized reaction. And my colleague came over. He was like, hey, you know what, Sebastian, like, let me tap you out. Let me check in with this young person. And then checking in with my colleague after this situation, he was like, hey, you know, maybe not your first interaction with a young person be like limit setting. And maybe you might want to introduce yourself. Maybe you might want to say hello. And then the other piece, and this was like months later, as I got to know and learn this young person, we kind of talked about that situation. And he was like, yo, listen, like, I was in prison for a very long time. And you walking by, peeking in by me, like, gave me like corrections officer vibes, right? And so for me, that was kind of like an aha moment, understanding like there's so much more behind the behavior that's present. To me, I'm like, yo, this dude, he's bugging out. But I didn't know what I meant for him, like my presence and the way I was engaging, what that meant for him. And then for me, that was like a very captivating moment and really kind of changed my approach and how I engaged young people in the milieu. And since we're doing quotes, I want to do a quote. So there's a quote that actually my colleague had just shared with me this morning. And it says, when you finally learn that a person's behavior has more to do with their internal struggle than it ever did with you, you learn grace. And so that was something that really sat for me.
Now you have to say who said that too, if you know.
I will find out.
I know that's the next question, but I think what I'm gathering is like being intentional, right? So not just taking things at surface level, but digging a little deeper, trying to be intentional about getting understanding and seeing where people are coming from. Jamie, I want to circle back to you. I know you define trauma, but give you an opportunity to define trauma-informed care as well.
Yeah, I really just love what everyone said, and I just want to conceptualize that. And I think if we can come from a place of curiosity rather than judgment, which is exactly what like Sebastian is saying, and I like to say, like, get curious about behavior, get curious about the function of behavior. So what need is getting met by this behavior? And whenever we identify that, doing it from a non-judgmental place. So it's really easy for us to use words like bad, difficult, and good, easy, things like that. But if we can come from a place of, let me get curious about what could possibly be going on within that person currently and in their past, or what they might be anticipating in the future, that's coming from a trauma-informed place. And to Lizzie's point, and or Deja's, is also getting curious about how systems impact this person and how that has impacted like how they're showing up for you. So like as a white lady, I acknowledge like if I'm going into a group home of predominantly youth of color, what I represent and what I represent currently and historically for them. So again, I'm getting curious about, I wonder what their relationship was like with people that looked like me, and let me go in and learn more about that and not make assumptions or place judgment. So I just wanted to share that. So curiosity over judgment and assumptions, I really think is at the root of trauma-informed care.
I really appreciate all the definitions and even the story that was told centered around that. And so my next question really is, how can organizations infuse trauma-informed care into their structure, into the practice, the policies, everything that they do? And what does that look like in action? And I'll start with you, Lizzie, if you don't mind.
I think there's a lot that organizations can do to shift and create space to examine their own practices. I think it has to start from a place of listening to and centering the experiences of people who have experienced harm and what it is that they need. So, for example, at HMI, we regularly try to hold space for listening circles for youth members where young people can come and speak to some of the things that they're going through, and also what kinds of supports, both the supports that they've been able to access at HMI, but also supports that they haven't been able to access that they've been looking for. So really being open to and creating space for regular feedback around the needs of young people or whoever you're serving. And that also means being open to hearing feedback around what's not working, or harm that may have occurred, or things like that. I also think it's important for organizations to regularly commit to ongoing training and learning opportunities for staff. And staff have different needs based on their own identity experiences and their intersections and where they're coming from. To Jamie's point too, right? You have to take into account the identity and the experiences of staff, and to make sure there's space for regular learning, and both deconstructing biases as well as creating space for healing or support. I know that during the earlier part of the pandemic, there was a huge need for staff to come together, also to connect with each other across the ways in which the COVID pandemic was impacting people's experiences, both in work and outside of work. And that really differed across different groups. In particular, we saw big differences based on people's racial identity. So there were a lot of our staff who identified as Black or people of color who really were requesting healing spaces where they could talk about experiences of medical racism or like other police brutality, other experiences of harm. And it was important to create safe spaces and affinity spaces for staff and for youth to create that, to have those opportunities. And similarly for white staff members, white cis staff members like myself, it was important to create space for really unpacking and looking at the ways in which bias implicates our own responses to young people, and how to continue that process of unlearning the sort of like ways in which white supremacist thinking is ingrained. So all of those things are really connected back to this idea of trauma-informed care, or like community-centered healing, where people are really taking into account their starting point, where they need to learn from, and also really centering and listening to the needs of people who are most impacted.
I think that you just brought something up that I didn't really even think about, but you're absolutely correct. 2020, 2021 was a time where we did see a lot of organizations start to take a minute to say, okay, let's process together as a group, right? And whether that was broken up by race or whoever, however groups naturally formed, or if it was entire organizations. And so, it's my hope, and I'm always wondering, like, are people still doing that? Now that things have calmed down, if you will, are people still having those safe spaces within their own organizations? And if not, is that something that organizations can start to implement, like ongoing, right? Not just going in because it's the cool thing to do right now, right? But being able to keep it up, not only for youth, I heard you say, but then also, staff and people that are doing the work day in and day out. I would love to hear from others on this. How can organizations infuse trauma-informed care into their structure, their practice, their policies, and what does that look like in action?
I'll go. I think there's a lot of things that agencies and programs can do. I know at our program, one of the things that is baseline is that the staff is reflective of the population that we serve. So we have a very diverse staff. A client can come into our space and see in all areas, both in leadership, both in direct staff, someone who reflects who they are. And I think that's super important. Clients are also very much involved in our hiring practice, right? So that for anyone who's going to be potentially onboarded, to our program, as a staff person, they have to be interviewed by our young folks. And so that, I think that is, for us, like that is something that will never go away. Even though it kind of prolongs the hiring process, that is super essential in having clients feel like, wow, I am very much involved with who I interact with in this space. And it kind of gives young people more ownership and feel more, attachment to the program. Then thinking about the physical space. So like having images that reflect young people's identities, whether it be like a flag, or whether it be posters or groups, that reflect our young people's interest. I think that is also super, super important. The other thing too, and I think, to Lizzie's point, is that staffing, like the training is super important, but not just training, right? So some folks just go to training, it's like, oh, check that off my checklist, but also that those trainings and the things that we put in place for young folk, for staff to learn, are also being reinforced in supervision, right? So clinical supervision, group supervision, that is essential. That's super important for staff, and also thinking about that curiosity piece that Jamie was talking about. The other thing that we do is we do something called a long form at our program. And what that is essentially kind of like, instead of just kind of talking about young people like, yeah, strengths, weaknesses and all those things, kind of really digging and delving deep. It's like not only just asking what this young person's strengths is and risk categories, but also like, how do you feel about this young person? Does this young person trigger you? Because I think that is super important for staff to be aware of. Sometimes, in our interview process, we have this question where we say, can you, is there anything that might trigger you in working with this population? And everyone thinks that the answer is, oh, no, I'm good. Like, I'm fine. Like, nothing triggers me. But that's like, not that there's a right or wrong answer, but it's like, actually, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for your ability to identify what may trigger you and then have a conversation around how are you going to manage that in working with someone who might be triggering. And I think that is super, super important to kind of create those spaces. But to my point, the long form really pauses staff. Like we actually, because when you're in it, you kind of like forget about, the some of the important stuff, like how you talk to a young person, like how you leading with your pronouns and not assuming, right? Because that might be triggering if you misgender someone. You know what I mean? Like, and I think supervision is where a lot of those things can be supported. We also have something where we're asking young people to be vulnerable with us, but staff also need to be that way too. So we have like a process that happens monthly where all the staff get together and we literally kind of just like, it's kind of like it feels like group therapy. It's facilitated by an outside facilitator, and the whole point and the reason why this exists is because this work is hard. And no one here is Superman, and so it's important to kind of like share about your experiences, whether it with a young person, how that might have impacted you, and then also hear like, oh wow, I'm not the only one feeling that. My coworkers are also kind of feeling a similar thing. Yeah, I think creating spaces like that for staff, also affinity groups like Lizzie had mentioned, and for both staff and clients are super important. But that supervision piece, because sometimes we bring our own, I don't know if I can curse here, but sometimes we bring our own crap into the work, and it really impacts how we might engage with young people. And that's super important for us to all be mindful of. And so vicarious trauma, like training around vicarious trauma, I think anybody working in the helping profession should have certain trainings. And I think definitely vicarious trauma is one of those.
You just answered one of the questions I was going to ask, because I heard Lizzie mention, Sebastian, you mentioned trainings. What trainings exist? What trainings should we be conscious and intentional of making sure that frontline staff are receiving? So vicarious, I heard you say, Sebastian, I heard trauma-informed care, I think is a training. What other trainings should folks be receiving?
LGBTQ sensitivity. I know that, and to be frank, to be like direct, not everyone does the training in the most efficient way. I think HMI does a really wonderful, shout out to HMI, Lizzie, does a really great training series around LGBTQ sensitivity. And I think, like our program is not an LGBTQ specific program, but we a majority of our young folks who come to our program identify as that, right? And so, yeah, you'll walk into the space and you'll see a trans flag. You'll see all identities all throughout our program, and I think that's super important because young people want to see that. That's important to young folks when they come into space, that they see a sign that says, you matter, or you are not your trauma. Like, that's important. That's the other thing that's super important, is like, yes, we're talking about trauma and all these things, but also, like, we don't want to look at our young people in this one little box as like, oh, they are their traumatic experience, which can sometimes happen with staff. When young people share a lot about themselves, they kind of look at them through this one lens and not realizing that they're resilient, and that, I feel like I'm going on a tangent, but
I wonder, anyone else on the call to open up any other trainings, suggestions?
I know it's a big ask, but it's an important ask. I think a lot of times we think that we can send our staff to trainings and it's like, learn how to do the UCLA trauma assessment, learn how to do this. And it's really important that this is happening at the top. I think that we'll say that our employees go through these trainings and we have people that are employed with us that have this certification or whatever acronym behind their name. But to really like become a trauma-informed agency, like, it has to be adopted throughout the organization. And we can't expect the employees to be practicing something that they're not experiencing themselves. So in your supervision, from leadership at the very top down, we should be operating with trauma-informed practices of like that curiosity, not assuming the worst. I like to call it like a generous interpretation. Like, if something happens, let me offer a generous interpretation rather than assuming the worst. But again, like, I come from an agency that adopted the attachment regulation competency framework, or ARC framework, and they adopted it throughout the entire organization. And so our team members, our executive team members, had to go through this and sit with a consult that was hired out. And then we had trained the trainers. I was one of the trainers that went through it. And then I onboarded all our new employees and they had to go through this training. And through our trainings, we're really talking about each other and our experiences in the work, rather than just talking about like, yeah, and then you have this client that does this and we respond in a trauma-informed way by doing this. There's definitely space for that, but ultimately, like, these trainings were only in person and not via WebEx or recorded, because we wanted you to experience feeling, felt, seen, and heard, which is a very, very important aspects of trauma-informed care. So I will just say that whatever you adopt, whatever framework or whatever, it's just so important that it comes from the top down and throughout the organization, and not just sending frontline staff to trainings.
Very good point. Yeah, it really stood out to me when you said, you can't expect your employees to do something that they're not experiencing, right? So that felt heavy. But yeah, good information. And I want to go back to this thought of like the systematic trauma, right, that exists. And so how do you identify and address systematic trauma that results from biases against individuals based on their identities, whether that's BIPOC or Two-Spirit or LGBTQ plus populations? Like, how do you identify and address that systematic trauma? And I'll start with Sebastian. You seem like you were on a roll, so let's kick it off.
No, I think kind of Lizzie kind of brought this up earlier, is like the affinity groups. I think creating a space for, a safe space for young folks to just share in community is super important. And those are the spaces, oftentimes facilitated by staff who identify as part of similar communities is super important. And just kind of creating that space, because we also don't want to take up the space, right? Especially if a young person is not bringing that to our attention, but we don't want to act as if we are not aware of certain things, right? So actually right now, next door to me, we're doing, this week is Trans Awareness Week. And so we're having an event, it's called like a seat at the table, right? And it's led by folks who identify as trans, and they're going to be answering certain questions, and our clients are there to attend, right? And the important piece to that is that staff who are facilitating that don't identify as trans. And so we went out and got an outside facilitator to create that space so that it was authentic to the young folks who are going to be attending. Just as an example. Yeah.
No, I think that's good. I wanted to pass it back to Lizzie because you did mention a lot. So let's circle back over to some of your suggestions as well.
Yeah, I totally echo what Sebastian's saying around affinity spaces. I feel like that's so important for young people. Also thinking about not just group spaces, but individual spaces. I think we're also really focused on trying to make sure that our staff reflect the youth members, and that youth members have choice around, when they say, I really need support from a clinician, or I need support from somebody on the health and wellness department, or wherever it is, that they have choice around who they go to see, because it's important that they feel safe in going to that person, especially in moments of vulnerability or when they've experienced something harmful. And, like Sebastian mentioned, it's Trans Day of Remembrance this week. And this evening, actually starting in a couple of hours, we have a group for our trans and gender nonconforming youth members, led by a staff member who also identifies as part of that group. That's really meant to be a healing space, because I think, as important as Trans Day of Remembrance is in terms of being able to name the harm in particular that is done towards trans folks, that can also, in and of itself, just speaking openly or having a lot of people speak about harm that has been done to a particular community can also be triggering or upsetting, or just weighs heavily to hear that narrative or to hear those stories told. As important as it is to speak the truth, it's also important to create spaces for healing and celebration and joy and connection to many of the incredible trans ancestors who have come before and have done all this amazing work within the community. So, particularly creating a multitude of different spaces for both remembrance and then also for healing and support within that affinity space has been a really important, example of the kinds of spaces that are important for being able to center the needs again of people who are most impacted. And I think, if we zoom back and just think about how to identify or even begin to understand how systemic trauma can impact folks, again, it starts from that place of really listening and centering experiences of people who are impacted, but then also for the organization to do work around creating spaces for people to process, for people to learn. The supervision piece that Sebastian mentioned is also so important, because it's about that ongoing emotional processing and how you're actually integrating the things that you're coming up against, or the ways in which you're in relationship or in community. And I think that's also part of this work, is to really focus on being in community with one another, because that's part of how we build support. So that's what I would say for that.
Thank you. And I'm just listening and as you all are speaking, it just makes me like think like, man, like training is just so crucial, right? So the supervision is crucial. You know, how many times have we gone to a training because you have to do an annual training, and like someone said already, it's like you're just trying to check off a box. But like, are we really taking what we need to hear and taking it back and putting it into practice? And so as you all were speaking, I was thinking about conversations that I was part of with former staff in regards to, you know, the police killings and things like that were happening, and how when we were having just open conversation, there were a lot of staff that just said, I don't feel comfortable navigating conversations with certain clients about what's going on in the news and how they're processing and everything. And so like, how do we get them to the point where they are comfortable? Like if the young people are comfortable coming to staff to have those discussions, we better make sure that our staff are comfortable with having those discussions as well. And so it just goes back to what you all are saying about the training, about the supervision, and making sure that it's like two-way, right? And it's ongoing. So it's not something like we're checking off boxes, but we're really digesting and we're internalizing and putting into practice what it is that we're hearing, what we're learning, and just implementing it on a regular basis. So anybody else want to jump in on that before I kind of switch gears a little bit?
I think to your point, Angela, I think, and sometimes staff might never be comfortable with having certain conversations, but I think the point is that to just hold space for that young person. So we may not be able to kind of like, you know, articulate certain things, but as long as we're just kind of there and present and, you know, letting that young person kind of share, I think that's enough for me.
That's important. So this question I really wanted to target towards Erdacia. So hopefully, okay. I was gonna say, hopefully you're still in a good place. But what steps can organizations and staff take to avoid re-traumatization of youth that they serve? You know, and I heard Lizzie kind of talk about it a little bit in regards to, you know, when we have these spaces, you know, sometimes that can be triggering, but how do we avoid re-traumatization for the youth that we're serving?
Yes, I've been waiting for this question. Yeah, sorry, y'all, the Wi-Fi is tricky a little bit, so just want to make sure that I can keep hearing, so I turn on my video. But yes, I'm very lucky to have been working with Point Source Youth for a while, because they have honestly taught me a lot about what it means not to re-traumatize youth, and working with them. So like I said, I've been working with Point Source Youth for 3 years now. So I guess I still am a youth, but was very much a youth when I started, very much coming out of traumatic experiences, and Point Source Youth helps me by always leading with consent. It was always on me to accept, to say if I wanted to do something, to say if I wanted to speak about my experiences. Point Source Youth also always pays, which is nice. That's never something that I have to ask about, which I think is something I would have definitely struggled with. Like, having money is great, but yeah, coming from the experiences I've come from, necessarily asking for that money or feeling like you can ask and like you're worth asking was a big barrier. So the fact that Point Source Youth was always like, this is what we can pay. Should we pay more? That I think is a very good approach to it. I even have had, I've talked to one of the staff members on Point Source Youth about a little bit more about freelance work. So just really talking to youth about what they're worth, what they should be getting paid, and what that looks like, I think is a really important part to not re-traumatizing youth. And then I think I had another note. Oh yeah, last thing, just be extremely clear with the expectations as well. Tell the youth up front, like, yeah, you're gonna talk about this really difficult experience and it might bring up other emotions, other things, and tell them what supports that are in place for that. As another thing that I really appreciated Point Source Youth for, that they always very clear, like, we want you to talk for this long. You don't have to bring up that experience, or if you want to, you can bring whoever you are to the experience. Yeah, so those 3 things: being clear, always remembering consent, and then there should be some money involved, and it shouldn't be on the youth to ask for it.
All good points. Jamie, it looks like you want to jump in, so I'm gonna go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to repeat a lot of what Erdacia said. But I think the Mental Health Commission of Canada does a really great job of outlining like quick, dirty ways to make sure that we're doing our best to avoid re-traumatization. They recommend like self-awareness. So I think about how some of us use humor as like a coping skill, and sometimes we can make jokes about stuff we've been through. COVID is a good example. Like a lot of us make jokes about what we've been through in COVID, and there are people who've experienced really traumatic experiences associated with COVID. So just having self-awareness of who you're around, what you're saying, and the tone, the context that you're saying it could impact somebody. Sometimes I know historically, like, I don't feel like it's as common now, but people would make flippant comments of like, oh, I could just do this to myself or something like that. And that could really have an impact on somebody who has a history of exposure to a trauma associated with whatever that thing may be. So just being really self-aware about how the stories you tell, the comments you make could impact somebody. The next one is fair warning. So like just letting folks know if you need to vent, are you like asking for consent? Like, can I vent? We in like therapy world call it sliming. So if we come out of something that was really stressful and we're under our umbrella where we can do like supervision or something and talk about it, we give like fair warning, like this is somewhat difficult content, like does everybody feel like they have the capacity to hear this? And while we're saying it, we're being intentional about not oversharing details that are re-traumatizing to the people we're talking to. But I say that to say that like sliming can go beyond. Like sometimes I'll come home and I maybe saw something terrible on the drive home, and I tell my partner like, I don't want to slime you, but I feel like I need to share what I just saw. It was really hard for me to see. But getting consent from that person, if they have the capacity to process with you. So self-awareness, fair warning, consent, and limited disclosure, which we talked about. So just being mindful of not oversharing just for like a shock and awe factor. Being patient, acknowledging that healing is not linear. It's going to go up and down. It'd be nice if everything went like as a textbook, but that's not real life. And no, that's not how this is going to go. That would be too easy. You wouldn't have a job. And then to Erdacia's point, like not forcing somebody to talk about anything that they don't want to talk about, or just sharing what they feel comfortable talking about, and allowing them some creative liberties in how they talk about it. So if it's a traumatic experience, but we're not ready, like part of our trauma journey is that we can't name that person, we can't say their name. What is something else that we can say that's less triggering? If we just use pronouns like him, but we never say the name out loud yet, we're not there. The activity, we call it, drawing, like I'm not comfortable drawing right now, whatever it might be, just following their lead and allowing them that liberty to name like how they want to talk about this. And when they come to you and they want to talk about it, and when they come to you and like, I'm having a good day and I don't want to go there today, I would rather the time that we have together be spent playing Uno, because that is part of work. Having healthy relationships and practicing pro-social communication and social skills is part of the work. And if you have to write notes about your interaction with a youth, trauma-informed practices really help you with writing that note, so that not every session has to be talking about the thing, or not every engagement has to be about talking about the thing. Your engagement can just be having a positive social interaction, and that is being trauma-informed and doing beautiful work.
Thank you. And I want to get to something you said in a second, but very quickly, I'm just doing a time check. We're going to get to Q&A in about the next 10, 12 minutes. So if you have any questions, I just want to remind everyone to put that in the Q&A section. We're going to pull those questions and ask it to the panel. So please make sure that you're adding any questions that you may have. Something that you mentioned, Jamie, it was to the, like, being patient, right? So like, that's what I took from is like, you have to be patient. It takes time, make time for that. And so my follow-up question, and this is for, I guess, if you want to start it off, but in a world where high production is expected, right? We're expected to produce on high levels. How can we slow down and critically examine the work that we're doing, the relationships that we're building, making sure they're not just transactional? Like, how do we slow down and still have our organizations be able to produce at the levels that they need to produce at? I know that's a whole loaded question, but hopefully you got the gist of it.
Yeah, I have some insight. I mean, I think that whenever I first came into the field, I was so anxious about doing everything right and following the textbook. And this is how this is supposed to look. And how am I showing? And I just had a lot of pressure. And so I think if we can always just pull ourselves back and look at it, and like I said, just having a positive, like, relaxed and get interaction with you is beautiful work. And worthwhile, then like that's what we're doing. I currently work, like I said, in pediatric healthcare, and I just did a talk about like self-compassion with physicians who, I mean, literally have no time to do anything. It's a really difficult field to be in. And one of the physicians talked about the idea of strategic underachievement. And I really love that. I think we hear strategic underachievement and we think, ooh, gosh, like, no, like that's a bad thing. Because I want to name that so many of us that are in this field are high achievers, high performers. And sometimes that is rooted in trauma because it makes us feel like we have a sense of control. If I can push out great outcomes and I can go, and I can show up for all these young people the way that I wish somebody could show up for me, then I feel like I have a sense of control over my own traumatic experiences. Not necessarily for all, but I just think it's important to name that. So the idea of bringing in the strategic underachievement threatens that, like, but I like to have control. I like to produce. A lot of my self-worth is rooted in my productivity, and like we have to work on like readjusting that. So strategic underachievement is identifying those places where things don't have to be perfect. And like perfect is not real. It's unrealistic to expect us to operate at 120%, 100% of the time. So what are ways that we can just like plug and chug and like not recreate the wheel? And this isn't going to be perfect, but this thing that matters a lot, like face-to-face time with the youth, that's where we excel. Those are my suggestions.
I love it. I'm open for more. Anyone want to jump in? Sebastian?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jamie kind of hit on a lot of points. I think how that looks like in our space is like literally there's a day out of the week where we see no clients and we dedicate that day to like staff development, but also like group supervision and doing the long form. And I think that is where we kind of slow things down and really talk about the work, talk about our clients. Yeah, in a nutshell.
Very good.
Go
ahead.
I might also add, like within organizations, particularly for folks who are in leadership, that being open to or hearing the needs of your staff. I know creating space, like we added some mental health days during the pandemic, which were very, very much needed and honestly needed on an ongoing basis, not just within the pandemic. That was important. And I think also just being mindful, if you are someone that has staff that report to you, of when you're asking someone to take on an additional project or to see an additional client, or even if it's like, oh, like this person would be a perfect match for you, and like they're super connected, it's going to be really fruitful and fulfilling, to also just be mindful of like, so I'm adding something to your plate, what's something I can take off, or how can we shift so that it isn't just participating in or perpetuating this like more and more and more dynamic. So thinking about those things too.
Helping to keep the balance, not just adding work, but sometimes take it away. I like that. I think just being intentional, right? I know at Point Source Youth, we do have time where we shut down the entire office, right? So that everybody has an opportunity to just breathe, and you don't have to worry about coming back to a million emails and things that you missed because the entire office is closed. And I love the idea of instituting more mental health days, and just checking the temperature of your staff, right? You know, if you're seeing that folks are stressed and seeing that folks are being pulled too thin, like, adjust, make some adjustments, whether that's giving days off or having safe places to talk about it or pulling work off to balance it a little bit more, whatever it is, just make the adjustment. So very, very good points. Yeah, I've enjoyed everything so far that has been said. And so checking in real quick, I think we're good on questions. We don't have any questions that I'm seeing yet. So feel free to add some questions if you have any, and I'll continue on with the questions that we have. And so my next question is, how do we advocate within our organizations to become trauma-informed internally as well as externally? So I'll ask Erdacia if you wouldn't mind starting us off.
Yes, perfect. From the last question, I love everything everyone was saying. Mental health days, yes. Shutting down the office, yes. I think these are the things that all organizations should be doing, and understanding reality right now, moving away from this world where high production was expected. I know it's going to be difficult to get all the organizations to be in a more trauma-informed place internally and externally. So yeah, hard work ahead for some organizations, and it's going to take some time. And I think I'm thinking of like it being very scary to go to maybe your higher ups and say, oh, can we have mental health days? That may be very scary. So I think again, taking it slow, maybe start off with some humor, or start off very lighthearted, like, could really use a day off, or like something like that, throw it out there. And then work your confidence up to lay out that formal proposal of this is why we should have mental health days in the organization. And I think the other thing I'm thinking about is talk to your coworkers. Definitely, like if you are feeling like you need an extra day off or you need a mental health day, I'm sure other people in the office are feeling the same way. And there is strength in numbers. So talk to them, and then y'all can go together to make the formal proposal. But yeah, like I said, it's going to be difficult. It's going to take some time to get there. And if we're not the ones doing it right now in our organizations, then it's not going to get done. So more power to y'all as you go out and find those coworkers who you're going to go make those proposals with. And yeah, well, so be it, see to it. We'll get it done.
Thank you. Lizzie, I'm going to ask you to jump in too. How do you advocate within organizations to become more trauma-informed care internally as well as externally?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to just lift up what Erdacia was saying. It is really tough, especially when you're up against systems or people in power who may not be open to the suggestions that you're making. Or, I think oftentimes we're talking about trauma-informed care, and so many of the systems that we work in are in and of themselves just so impacted by trauma. And I mean, this gets into a little bit vicarious trauma, but so oftentimes systems end up reproducing the same types of harm that we're also trying to stop from happening or support our clients from, in their experiences. So just naming that, these systems are often just full of trauma and traumatic experiences themselves. So definitely being able to seek support in community where you can find it, whether that's your supervisor or coworkers, or just looking for spaces where you yourself can feel seen and validated feels really important, because oftentimes trauma can work in a way that makes you feel very isolated. So being able to break that isolation is important. Definitely strength in numbers is helpful. If you happen to work in a place that has a union, being able to avail yourself of that kind of support as well is definitely critical. But really being able to speak, as openly and honestly as you're able to the needs of staff, particularly when it's something that lots of folks may be experiencing, is really helpful. So being able to sit down and write down what are the specific things that would be needed for more support. I think I'm also thinking about recently, HMI has engaged in a long-term set of DEI trainings, diversity, equity, inclusion trainings, meant to be long-term work, not just checking a box, but actually trying to work towards some systemic change within the organization. And there have been some really tough and open conversations around just how we're going to be able to find the extra time or create space to do some of this difficult work of going through our practices, or saying what is it that people need? How do we need to make a change? Because actually making change within organizations is usually long-term work. It's not, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So being able to really create structures that will allow it to continue, as opposed to those kinds of trainings you attend where you check a box and you move on. So again, that conversation, and I liked what Jamie was saying about, what was that strategic, I forget how you put it, underachievement.
Underachievement, yes, I wrote it down.
Yeah, so even if I can't take things off my plate, if we're going to really commit to doing some of this work or making change within the organization, what can I deprioritize so that I have more space and time and energy to be able to devote to the change? So.
And something that you just said relates to something someone put in the Q&A, which was, taking the time, getting to know youth, doing the important work. And they wrote, I believe it is also important to get to know the residents. What are their triggers? What helps them to cope? Their likes, what are their dislikes? And us learning the youth can help us to better serve them. But that takes time, right? And it takes effort. And so when I hear you say, strategic underachievement, I think about, all those other things that don't relate, directly with the youth, so that we can spend more time with youth, getting to know them, their likes. I think, Jamie, you mentioned playing Uno, and being able to just have just meaningful conversations that are not so what am I trying to say? So scripted, right? But being able to naturally have interactions with young people is very helpful. And so thank you for sharing and answering that question. We do have another question in the chat that I wanted to pose to everyone. It says, what strategies can help staff differentiate between trauma and an adverse life experience? And anyone can answer. I see you, Jamie.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I feel like this is good information for this, and in terms of things that organizations can, policies that they can start doing or practices, and that's safety planning. So when a youth is introduced to an organization, you can call it something else if that feels uncomfortable for youth. But when a youth comes into your practice and you all are going to be engaging with them, being trauma informed is acknowledging that there's a whole backstory to this person. So providing them the opportunity to create a plan, hey, we're just meeting each other. We're going to be doing a lot of assessments and things around housing or whatever it is that you do. And we just want to make sure that we're respectful of any experiences that you may have had. Do you have any triggers that would be helpful for us to be aware of in the building or in our interactions with you? So you're opening up the door where they can share that. And if they've never been asked that, we're kind of changing a narrative where we're letting them know it's okay to communicate to people that are part of your care team what upsets you and what doesn't upset you. And we're opening the door for them to share, what they identify as a traumatic experience and what's an adverse experience. I feel like differentiating between the two as a therapist, I would say, for me, it comes down to like symptomology. So a traumatic experience that you would say you're having come up for you, like you feel triggered, you're hyper vigilant, on edge, unable to sleep, impacts your ability to have relationships or things like that, I would say like, yeah, that sounds like it was a really traumatic experience in your life. And then something that like, yeah, you know, my parents were divorced or whatever, but it doesn't really feel like it impacts me. It's like, yeah, that's not a positive experience. And sometimes it can be for speaking personally, but yeah, I think just having them differentiate, like only you can really define what you would describe as like, this was really traumatic and impactful. And this just like wasn't my favorite thing that happened to me.
I think you just said something that made me think like there are some times that we assume that trauma happens when maybe it has not happened. And I think you just gave a very good example, you know, with the divorce, you know, that is traumatic, but it's not traumatic for everyone. Like, so being able to give young people, staff, individuals, the ability to define what trauma is for themselves. Not every situation that is traumatic for me is traumatic for the next person and vice versa. So I just kind of wanted to highlight, you said it, but I just wanted to highlight it a little bit more just to take a minute to pause to think about that, because I think that's correct. And sometimes we overlook that. We assume certain things. And so being able to, you know, going back when I heard consent, you know, but going back to letting folks define what trauma looks like, and then also being able to share what support looks like to them as well is very important.
Yeah. And I would say a way that you could like in practice, what that could look like is you're talking to them about their life and they share like, oh yeah, and then this thing happened. And for you, you might be like, whew, like that would be really hard for me. Like internally, we're thinking like, oh, that sounds really tough. And a way to assess where they're leaning in terms of adverse experience versus trauma is say, what was that like for you, if you don't mind sharing? Or can I ask you what that was like for you? And then you're gonna be able to further assess like, okay, like this is here and this is showing up and this is pretty difficult. Or right now, it's like they're feeling pretty like even keel about it and regulated about it. And that could always change. But I think just asking the question, like, can I ask what that was like for you? Or do you mind sharing what that was like for you, is a great way to assess like how that's showing up in their life.
Any other thoughts? Okay, I want to go ask another question, if that's okay. So what does, and we talked about this a little bit, but what is secondary traumatic stress? And how does it relate to organizations putting trauma-informed care into action? And I'll ask Jamie.
Yeah, so secondary traumatic stress is just the impact that hearing and seeing and responding to the trauma of others, like what that has on us. So showing up and working with youth who don't have housing, and like you go home every day, but like witnessing what they're going through and having that push-pull of like our own privileges and acknowledging that other people that we care about and oftentimes love don't have those same privileges. Like that is a wear and tear. A pretty like easy way to think about traumatic stress is like if somebody think of like healthcare workers, you know, they have people come into their hospitals in the emergency department and trauma, and like you witness really terrible things. And that has an impact on you. So like what impacts one person, it doesn't just stay with that one person, like it impacts the rest of us. Watching the news can be secondary traumatic stress. So just think about it as like the impact, hearing, seeing, being exposed to the experiences of other people. So there's like the primary victim and the secondary victim. And if we're just witnessing the primary, then we are secondary. And it's real and it requires some healing itself, especially whenever you're working in this work for a really long time. Like we experience burnout and compassion fatigue because we care so much for so long. And eventually, like if we're not filling our well, it's going to run dry, and that's burnout and compassion fatigue. So I feel like you asked me 7 other questions and I just got stuck on that one.
No, I didn't. I think that like your explanation really helped me, because when I originally saw the question, I immediately thought about staff, secondary traumatic stress, like as it relates to staff. But as you were giving your explanation and your answer, it made me think about the trauma that youth and those that we serve experience just from watching the news. Like the example that you gave was just like, it hit home with me, because there are certain times I find myself where I'm like, I cannot watch TV, you know what I mean? And I would go in and out of like, and I don't know what's happening in the world, because I'm like, I'm protecting myself right now from the TV. But I also know that there were moments when I felt like that I was very conscious that I also have youth or clients that I'm working with that have to feel the exact same way. And so, being able to realize that certain things that impact me, although I just said that it doesn't always impact others, that others may be impacted by it as well. And just being aware of that as you're interacting with youth and you're interacting with clients on a regular basis. So your explanation was perfect. It was great. And I will also open it up for others. What is secondary traumatic stress and how does it relate to organizations putting trauma-informed care into action?
I just want to echo a lot of what Jamie said. And there's like real physical impacts that it has on like staff, but whether it's like headaches, I know for me, like there was a period of time I was like stress eating because there was just so much on my mind. I was like, I gotta tackle this issue. I have to make sure that this thing is resolved. But then kind of transitioning into leadership, seeing the folks that I supervise be impacted by secondary stress, I think from an organization standpoint, and this is why, again, supervision is super important. Checking in with your team members around certain observations that you're making is like, you're staying a little later than usual. Like, did you get some rest? Like, did you get rest? You're here really early, or I'm seeing that this thing is really like impacting you physically. Like, maybe you should take a day, or I think that is super important, because again, this work is very difficult and it's very hard. And if we're not aware of those things or creating spaces for people to like decompress or engage in self-care, it will impact our clients. It'll trickle down to our clients. So that's why, trainings like vicarious trauma are super important.
Thank you.
Go
ahead.
I'd like to share this idea of like the parallel process that we experience. So like I just want to build on talking about secondary traumatic stress with youth, because I do think, to both of your points, we think about it in terms of like the caregiver, like us as the professionals, but yes, like the youth experience secondary traumatic stress. And if we just think about the moments where we have a youth or a person that's like having like big emotional responses, like the youth that was getting upset about asking to turn the music down. So like this youth escalates, or this person escalates, and then the direct care person or whatever worker is impacted by this escalation. Like we feel like, oh, I'm supposed to be in control, and like I need to address this and I need to work on it. And then the youth that are around watching this, like they are also exposed to this stress. In like, I feel out of control and you're supposed to make sure everything's okay, or you're the bad guy and I'm protected. Like there is a parallel process, and like I'm feeling out of control, this youth is feeling out of control, the youth around us is feeling out of control, and we're all going through this together. So a lot of times, if you are sitting with a youth and you're feeling like, gosh, I'm like insecure, like I can't seem to penetrate you, like I can't get anything out of you, we're not building rapport, it's like feels standoffish. The reality is like the youth is having like similar feelings towards you, and like if you can just tap into that and think like, I'm feeling really insecure and unsure about how to go about this, there's a chance that youth is having that same feeling towards you because of this parallel process that we learn about in trauma-informed care.
I have maybe one more piece to offer to all of these fantastic suggestions, which is just the power of creating spaces for both verbal processing, but also nonverbal processing. My training is I'm a licensed creative arts therapist. And so we do a lot of work too around, maybe sometimes making art together, or sometimes, if we're in that shared experience that Jamie was mentioning, even if we're all, we're having these parallel processes, my experience might be different from, Jamie's, might be different from Sebastian's, right? And so like also finding ways to connect across those and share what we're going through from our perspective is helpful. And that can be done by talking about it, or it could be, that everybody can pick some music that really reflects what that internal experience is like, and we're able to come together and do that. Or it doesn't have to be through creative arts. It can also be through like sharing a meal together, breaking bread, having opportunities to come together as a community and connect with one another. Often is part of what can help create spaces for healing, especially in times of vicarious trauma or times where the community has experienced collectively ruptures or moments of harm.
Thank you. And we have two comments, and well, a comment and a question in the chat. And I'm trying to figure out which one I want to say first. Let's go here. Any suggestions on how to support others with identifying their triggers? And so, I think with the example that Sebastian gave, the young person was able to come to you and kind of tell you why they reacted the way that they did, like they were able to make a connection. But any suggestions for if a young person is not making connections and they're not really understanding what triggers they may have, and helping us identify them? And that's for anyone on the call.
I think, particularly like in a drop-in setting where we have like the opportunity to kind of observe our young folks' interactions, whether with each other or with other staff. I guess my main point, building relationships with young people, like making the effort to like consistently, that's the key part, being consistently engaging young people around like, hey, like, how are you? Like, how's it going? What did you like? Remembering conversations, remembering what was said the day before, and following up like, oh, you said that you were going to go to this one thing, like whatever happened with that? Oh, well, and then having a conversation with that young person where they might be describing a negative interaction with the person, and then processing it with them. Like, oh, well, why did you think they said that? Well, I cursed at them. Oh, well, why did you, like I think creating those spaces and being consistent, even after there might be a rupture in the relationship, whether, like you have to set a limit with someone, like creating that space to re-engage with them despite, on their terms, right? You don't want to force it or push it. But I think creating like space to constantly engage and ask questions, like engage from a place of curiosity, like Jamie had suggested and mentioned earlier, I think is important to getting to that point where the young person will be able to identify their own triggers.
Thank you. I think that's important, and gets to a comment that was made earlier about, you actually have to get to know the young people, right? And being able to have those conversations and taking the time to do that. This comment, I think, is more about getting to know yourself as well and being able to see that. And the comment is, a part of addressing secondary trauma is being able to identify burnout, recognizing it within yourself, remembering to take 15-minute breaks, finding quiet place to regroup and to address what you are feeling. Being able to congratulate yourself as well is an important part. So we talked about that secondary trauma, but also recognizing when you're done, recognizing when you are like spent mentally, and being able to take those breaks, not sitting at the desk all day, and not doing, like, having minutes where you can go for a walk. I used to do a ton of walking meetings because I was always in meetings, especially during COVID when it first happened. we were at home and I'm like, you know what, I cannot sit here another minute. Like I will take this meeting from my phone as I walk the yard, you know? And so being able to take minutes like that, where you're just able to take a minute. So that's important in recognizing and addressing trauma that you may be experiencing. So thank you for that comment. I did have a question as well. Going back to something that was said previously, about addressing and making sure that we're trauma informed. And I think maybe Sebastian, your example, you had a coworker that came to you and had a conversation with you. So my question was really around, how do we hold each other accountable, not only for how we interact with youth as well, and making sure that it is with a trauma-informed lens, but also with each other. Like, how do we hold each other accountable? And this question is for anyone. And when I say we, I mean staff. Like, how, if you are, especially if you're someone new and you just meeting someone, like, and somebody says something that's just off the wall in a meeting, and you're like, ooh, you know, how do you go and have that conversation?
I think from a leadership perspective at my program, like creating that culture where it is okay to share, you know, whether, you know, one-on-one or in a group setting, observations made of another colleague. And so that happens in our group process. It happens in something we call special cases. So like where we may be deciding around a young person's ability to access our program. That's a shared decision-making, that's a shared decision process. It's not one person making that decision, it's all of us collectively. I mean, we like literally vote. And so that is a space where it's super important, especially if we care about the young people, that folks are bringing their voice into the room, and bringing their observations and their interpretations of certain interactions into that space. I know one of the things that we just recently did was a SWOT analysis of our program. So that's like, it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And we, you know, the supervisory team was not involved in that process. That was something that was facilitated by our like deputy CEO with our frontline staff. And then we kind of joined that process afterwards to really get some crucial feedback around where we're, like, our strengths, which is important to acknowledge, but also our weaknesses, and definitely opportunities and threats. So I think creating those spaces, and from a leadership perspective, like consistently saying, like, we are inviting, almost modeling it too. Like, please tell me how I could have handled that situation a little bit differently. You know, inviting that feedback is also important.
I think it's important that we shift from this idea that we allow ourselves to be uncomfortable to make other people comfortable. Because in terms of like holding people accountable, I feel like the fear is like, oh, I don't want to upset anybody, or I don't want to make them feel bad about themselves. And all of that is true. And I think that you can hold people accountable, and you can do it in a way that is supportive and offers a generous interpretation. And then how that person responds, whether they like internalize it and take it negative and they struggle to accept feedback, like that's information for them to have about themselves. But we have to continue this work. So in situations where I've had to like follow up with somebody in a meeting about like something that was said or whatever that was not trauma informed and was triggering for people involved, I tend to approach them individually, like just one-on-one, and offer that generous interpretation by saying, like, I know how important it is to you that you practice trauma informed care, or that you want people to feel comfortable and seen and heard in your space. And we have tried to avoid the word but, and I don't know if you noticed, but whenever X, Y, and Z, I noticed that this person did whatever, like you share that and just say, I just wanted to let you know because I know that that's really important to you, or something, to where you're coming to them with that generous interpretation of like, I know that you would not intentionally bring harm to others, and harm was brought to others because impact is more important than intention. And then we can say, like, if it's a new person, we don't necessarily have that relationship with them about like, I know how you are. We can just say like, hey, here we try to avoid using this phrase or terminology. I invite you to practice using this. Or I understand that you might not be familiar with using these pronouns. I invite you to, use this tool to practice utilizing pronouns to make you more comfortable. So those kinds of phrases I think can be helpful. And then what I said initially is that like our job is to move the work forward. And sometimes that's going to make people uncomfortable. And we don't always have the capacity to like take care of everybody. So people can do work on their own. And that doesn't have to be your responsibility. Give the ball back is what we like to say.
Give the ball back. I like it. All right, so I want to, and I'm watching the time in our final 6 minutes. So I'm going to ask everybody if you can give, a minute or two response. But what is one step that everyone on this call can take to practice trauma-informed care with individuals they serve, their families and their friends, as well as their colleagues? So one step, and I'm going to ask everyone to answer in whatever order you feel comfortable in.
I'll go. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yes, if you've been at a Points for Truth conference before, you might have been able to be a part of a space I lead called Let's Breathe. Really enjoy leading that space. Breath work is a really important practice to me, so I like to share it with others. When I first started college, I realized that I was not breathing really. Not deeply, not in a way that was restoring my body, not in a way that was rejuvenating. Was kind of just getting through life. And so reconnecting with my breath, coming back to it, slowing down, doing the different breathing exercises has really helped me like realize my own traumas and just be a better person in the world. So please remember your breath. Just take a few deep breaths right now if you can. And then there's lots of different exercises out there to look up. So.
Feel like we needed a pause to just breathe for a second. So thank you for that. Sebastian, once you catch your breath, I'll let you go ahead.
It's crazy that you knew that because that's exactly what I was doing. I was breathing. Thank you, Irdesha. I guess it's not one thing, but a few things that folks can do is when engaging with a young person or a family member or a friend, come into that conversation identifying the strengths rather than deficits, like employ empathy, and especially with young folks, like understanding the suspicions that they may have of systems, because we do represent systems, and definitely cultural humility, like always self-examining ourselves, self-reflecting, I think is some of the ways that folks can really kind of engage in some trauma-informed care.
I would maybe offer two things. So one is related to what Sebastian was just saying around approaching young people, is trying to approach situations from a place of curiosity, particularly when there's like a big response or a big moment that's happened, really getting curious around what kind of things might have led that person or those people to those big responses. And coming from that place of curiosity will help, I think, help you to be more open to what's going on or trying to understand, because a lot of trauma responses are also driven by survival, and they are built to protect the person who is expressing themselves in that way. So really trying to get an understanding, come from that curious place of how that response, even if it didn't have a great outcome, how that response was protective for that person. Because we can't just take away somebody's coping mechanism without replacing it with something that feels more helpful or more useful to them. The other step that I would recommend is maybe just finding a good accountability buddy, somebody who you can come to, speak to, who you feel comfortable with, but not just somebody who's going to listen to you vent or listen to you talk about what's going on, but also to really help hold you accountable and ask you some really great and deep, meaningful questions around your role or how that situation impacted you, to work on reflecting on these experiences when we're going through. So seeking out that good accountability buddy is helpful.
I agree with Lizzie. My main one is like practicing curiosity, getting curious about functions of behavior. And you can practice this on the TV. You can practice it, like I said, with your family. And again, once you're starting to get curious, offering a generous interpretation rather than making the negative assumption, and language. So we're practicing getting curious and then really being intentional about the language we use. Like I said, trying to avoid words like but, and saying things like help me understand rather than it seems like to me or something like that. Can you tell me more about that? I'm interested in what, like just using language that's inviting, and always offering for somebody to say that they don't want to share anymore, but just using verbal and nonverbal language that invites the person and practices patience and openness, for them to share, because trauma needs to be seen to be healed. And if you are privileged enough to find yourself in a position where you get to observe somebody's trauma with them, with their consent, it's a really beautiful place to be. And how you interact during that time is very important.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I am looking at the time and realizing that we are just out of time. But I wanted to remind everyone on the call that there will be a video recording that will be going out, as well as a toolkit that everyone will have access to. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and to our panel of experts, I want to give you an especially appreciative thank you for sharing on this important topic. Yeah, so this is all we have for today. I want to remind you all to complete your surveys that will be going out. And until next time, I'm wishing you all peace, warmth, and comfort. So yeah, thanks and have a wonderful rest of your day.